Me again with chapter 3. Still haven't done my tree, but I will. And when I do, oh my goodness me, it'll be beautiful. We have the most lovely little decorations for our tree. We buy a new one every year. This is one of them. I love this. This is kind of old-fashioned, isn't it? It's a bit like you would imagine maybe one of the children might have, made of wood. Very old one, this one, with a velvet ribbon. A lovely little face. Anyway, we'll have lots of decorations to show you. Next time, it's my turn. So now we're on chapter 3, the favourite. And if you remember, yesterday, Councillor Drosselheisen, or whatever his name was, came round with that beautiful little wind-up theatre for the children, and they did kind of like it, but they were more excited by their other toys, and they were a little bit rude to him, and he was a little bit grumpy. But you know, I suppose things like that can happen, can't they, especially on the excitement of Christmas Day. So this is called The Favourite. So it's still Christmas Day. Mary, in fact, could not tear herself away from the table of presents, since she just discovered on it something that till now was unseen. The marching off of Fred's hussars, previously paraded close in front of the Christmas tree, left exposed to view a very remarkable little man who stood still in the background, as if quietly awaiting his turn for notice. Did you remember most of the toys were made of wood? The figure indeed was not much to be proud of, for besides that, his rather long, thick body by no means fitted his small, thin legs. His head also seemed far too big. His nice clothes, however, which bespoke a person of taste and cultivation, went far to make up for this deformity. He wore a very fine, shiny, violet hussar jacket. Remember, hussars are soldiers. With many white buttons and braidings, pantaloons. That's the name for trousers. I think we should start calling trousers pantaloons, don't you? Pantaloons. Pantaloons of the same stuff, and the most elegant boots that ever adorned the feet of a dandy undergraduate, or any officer. They fitted his neat little legs as closely as if painted on them. Ridiculous it was indeed that this costume he had hanging behind him a short, clumsy cloak or hood which looked exactly like wood, and a queer little woodsman's cap on his head. Here's a picture. Well, I'm not sure I imagine him to look like that. I imagine him to be much more handsome. But anyway, never mind. Let's pretend we haven't seen that and all have our own image of what we think he looks like. But Mary bethought herself that Godfather Drosselmeyer, that's it, Drosselmeyer, also sometimes wore a very ugly lounging jacket and a dreadful cap, yet was a dear, good godfather for all that. Also, she considered that their godfather would not be nearly so good-looking as a small figure. I don't think he's good-looking. Even if, in other respects, he were dressed just as smartly. I don't know if you can hear that clinking clanking in the other room, by the way, but that's mince pies being made. As Mary kept looking harder and harder at this mannequin, who'd quite taken her heart at first sight, she came to perceive what a kindly nature was expressed in his countenance. His clear green, and certainly too prominent eyes, bespoke nothing but friendliness and benevolence, and it suited his looks well that his chin bore a well-trimmed beard of white cotton, which set off the pleasant smile on his bright mouth. "Oh, Papa," cried Mary at length, "who is to have this dearest little man on the Christmas tree?" "That," said her father, "that fellow, my dear child, is to make himself useful to you all. His work is to crack hard nuts for you, and he belongs to Louisa as much as to Fred and to you." With this, her father carefully took the figure off the table and, lifting up its wooden cloak, made the mannequin's mouth gape open to show 2 rows of very tiny, sharp white teeth, and then he told Mary to put a nut in, and crack! The man had crushed it so that the shell of the nut fell to pieces, and Mary got the small kernel in her hand. Apologies to anybody listening to this who has a nut allergy. One of my children has a nut allergy, so I really sympathise, but let's pretend it's something else if you have it. Basically, the main thing is that we have a toy. Now Mary and all might know that the elegant little man belonged to the race of Nutcrackers and practised the profession of his ancestors. But the little girl cried out for joy when her father said, "Since friend Nutcracker pleases you so much, dear Mary, he shall be your special charge and pet, though, as I said, Louisa and Fred has as much right to him as you do." She's going to have to share. Never mind. Mary at once took him in her arms and Sorry, it's getting very noisy in the kitchen. Mary at once took him into her arms and made him crack nuts, yet picking out the smallest ones in order that the mannequin might not have to stretch his mouth quite so wide open, which was not good for him. Louisa came to look, and for her also friend Nutcracker had to perform his services, which he seemed to do with good will, for he kept smiling on in the most amiable way. Meanwhile, Fred had grown tired of all his riding and drilling, so when he heard such a pleasant cracking of nuts, he ran to his sisters and laughed heartily at the funny little man, who, as Fred also liked to eat, passed from hand to hand and was never allowed to stop opening and shutting his mouth. It's showing quite well so far. Fred always kept shoving in the biggest and hardest nuts, but all of a sudden there was a quick, 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 and the teeth fell out of the Nutcracker's mouth, and his underjaw went loose and wobbly. Oh, my poor dear Nutcracker," cried Mary, snatching him out of Fred's hand. "What a silly, stupid fellow," exclaimed Fred. "Sets up for being a nutcracker and hasn't even got a good set of grinders. He doesn't seem to be very first-rate at this business. Hand him over, Mary. He shall go on cracking nuts for me, even though he loses all his teeth and his whole chin into the bargain, which is what such a good-for-nothing toy deserves." "Fred! He's not being a very good boy, is he, this Christmas Day?" No, cried Mary in tears. "You're not to have him, my dear Nutcracker. Just see how sadly he looks at me and shows his sore little mouth. But you're a cruel boy. You beat your horse and you have your soldiers shot." "That's what should be. You don't understand these things," answered Fred. "But the Nutcracker belongs to me as much as to you. Hand him over here." Mary began to cry bitterly and made haste to wrap up the wounded Nutcracker in her small pocket handkerchief. Her parents and godfather Drosselmeiser interfered. The latter, to Mary's grief, took Fred's part, but her father said, "I have put Nutcracker under Mary's protection, and since, as I see, he now needs it, she has full power over him, and nobody is to say a word against her. Besides, I am very much surprised at Fred that he should require fresh duty of a man injured on service. As a good soldier, he ought to know that wounded men are never put back in the ranks." Fred was much ashamed of himself, and without troubling further about nuts or the Nutcracker, slipped off to the other side of the table where his hussars had been posted for the night, after twitting out the proper pickets. Mary picked up Nutcracker's lost teeth. Around his hurt chin she bound a nice white ribbon taken off her dress, and then wrapped the poor little fellow, who looked very wan and dejected, more carefully than ever in her pocket handkerchief. Thus she held him, rocking him like a baby in her arms, while she turned over the pretty picture book which lay amongst the rest of the presents. She became quite cross, as was not at all usual with her, when Godfather Drosselmeier laughed a great deal and kept asking how she could go on with that hideous little creature. Not very nice. He means the Nutcracker, by the way, not Fred. So that hideous little creature. The strange resemblance to Drosselmeier, which had struck her at first, setting eyes on the mannequin, came again into her mind, and she spoke quite seriously. "Who knows, Godfather, whether if you were to make yourself as fine as my dear Nutcracker and had as nice shiny boots on, who knows whether you would look as pretty as he does?" Mary did not understand why her parents laughed so loud, or why the councillor